Hello and welcome to the Services School Stories podcast. You'll hear from veterans and partners who'll share their stories and insights about how you can use higher education to transition from the military and achieve your goals. Now let's get going. All right, welcome to the podcast. Our guest today is Dr. David Gioe, goes by Dave. He is currently a professor at King's College in its War Studies department. Before his current role, he served as an FBI agent and a CIA case officer. Also served in the U.S. and is currently still serving in the U.S. Navy Reserves as a foreign area officer. And he was a professor at West Point as well. So a very distinguished and interesting career. So Dave, kicking us off, can you just give us a little bit about your background and what brought you to both the agency and the Navy Reserve?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, Alec. Just one quick edit. I was an FBI intelligence analyst, and then a CIA analyst, and then ultimately a case officer. So the people who are the special agents with the guns and the badges might arrest me for stolen valor. But in any case, I graduated. I was in college, sort of during the end of history in the 1990s, and was deeply interested in the international system, but didn't really know what that meant. From Philadelphia, but went to school in the Midwest, and just on a lark in 1998, I applied to CIA. At a time where there was such a thing as paper and envelopes and like stamps and post offices, and you couldn't do anything online. So I sent off my application and I got a call back and had a couple of interviews, and they were deeply unimpressed with what I had to say. And so they said, thanks a lot for your time. And I went away. So meanwhile, I figured out, well, how do I need to get better here? So did a little bit better with language, joined the reserves, as you know, went to Georgetown, got a master's degree, and then became a presidential management fellow. At that time, that was class of '01 out of Georgetown. And at that time, they're presidential management interns, and they subsequently upgraded it to the PMF program. But I just saw about 3 days ago that the PMF program has been canceled. So we'll see what happens there. But in any case, so I spent 2 years in the Bureau as an intelligence analyst, and I didn't really feel like that was the right fit for me. So went over to CIA, and I think that was a better fit. And then ultimately just decided I want to be a case officer and go to the farm and work overseas. So did about 4 tours altogether, and that was great. And I guess I can sort of go into why I got the academic bug again, which actually I owe to the Navy, because as I was serving overseas, and as you know, you have to do your joint professional military education. So I did mine through the College of Distance Education at the Naval War College, and they sent me this huge box of books, and I just started reading again, right? Strategy and Policy, or Strategy and War, whatever it's called. And I just, that was probably 2009 or 2010, and it awoke a part of my brain that had been dormant since I graduated from the master's program at Georgetown in 2001. And I was like, oh, this is pretty neat. And so I started thinking, about strategy and war and policy and all that stuff again, and, national security issues in a structured way. And I thought, oh, maybe I actually want to get a PhD. And the idea kind of took hold, and started applying around from there. And I looked at some U.S. programs, and the U.S. programs were like, okay, you have to take the GRE if you want to come do the PhD. And I was like, I took the GRE. And they were like, Dave, you took the GRE in 1998. Your scores expired. And I was like, I actually still had the scores. And I was like, well, I didn't get dumber. And they were like, well, subparagraph A, section 3 says that you have to have a fresh GRE score. And I was in Europe at the time, and you had to fly to Amsterdam to take the GRE. So I was like, fine. So I got a book on the GREs, and it was like, what's the circumference of a circle or a sphere or some volume? And I was like, I don't know. And I just kind of gave up on the GRE at that point. And also, I'd had a master's degree, but U.S. PhD programs make you do their masters. And so I was like, I don't want to spend another 2 years of, time and money and effort doing a master's when I already have a master's before I even start with the PhD. So I started looking in the UK, and I started chatting with a professor at the University of Cambridge. And I said, do I have to take the GRE? And he said, well, what would a standardized test tell me about your aptitude for intelligence studies? And I said, well, probably nothing. And he said, well, let's go with nothing. And no, we don't need a GRE. So I said, well, do I need to do a master's degree with you first? And he said, why would you have to do a master's degree? Don't you already have one? That's what it says on your resume. And I said, well, yes, I do. And he said, well, no, we're not going to do that again. And so I thought, okay, I think doing this in the UK probably gives me the flexibility to kind of do things my way. And so I didn't intend actually to leave CIA. I was initially on a leave of absence, but I just had, and they were like, well, all right, Dave, we don't really like this, but if your heart's set on it, go do your thing, come back in 3 years when you're done. And I was like, okay. But then I had so much fun reading about intelligence, writing about intelligence, speaking about intelligence, that I thought, actually, like, I don't really want to go back. And I actually think I can do more for the United States intelligence community and my country as a public voice talking about the role of intelligence in statecraft. And so ultimately I resigned and went to West Point instead.
Oh, wow. Okay, so a lot to unpack there. So definitely want to dive deeper into the PhD stuff, but I believe you are the first CIA officer we have had on this podcast. So this is very cool. And I do want to touch on that a little bit. So first question is, so that you started off as an analyst and then became a case officer. Can you talk to our listeners a little bit about what the difference is in those two roles and kind of like what each does and the kind of the core skills that someone would have to be good at it?
Sure. So there's two different schools of thought on this. I enjoyed being an analyst and I enjoyed being a case officer. But other people say that's a rare thing, and generally people are sort of better at one or better than, I guess better at one. The CIA itself would say that you need a master's degree to be an analyst, and you have to have good grades to be an analyst, and you have to, sort of be a bit of a nerd in your field to be a good analyst. To be a case officer, actually, they don't have the same grade requirements because they sort of thought you have to have a magnetic personality. And instead of joining the chess club, it might be better if you could sort of, I don't know, just do other things, right? And just kind of be out there, be president of your fraternity or whatever. And so those are sort of the caricatures. I don't happen to think they're very accurate caricatures, by the way. I think some of the best case officers I ever met had PhDs and were deeply nerdy about something and actually just could sort of connect with potential agents about Chinese literature or Farsi poetry or whatever. But nevertheless, so what an analyst would do is an analyst goes to work. They do all source analysis, right? So they check what's coming in from CIA stations around the world. They check what NSA is putting out, what the State Department's putting out, what now, what we call OSINT, or I just call sort of the news, is tracking for that day. And then you see, oh boy, there's a story or there's an update or there's something I want to write for a policymaker. And then you kind of go from there. And potentially if the story is big enough or is timely enough, it could go all the way to the president. So it's analysts that write for the president. They're not case officers, not collection managers. They by and large do the briefing as well. So if you are a sort of you're a creature of the Beltway, let's say, if you're an analyst, good briefer, good writer, able to take a lot of disparate ideas and sort of distill them into a bottom line for a busy policymaker. Very apolitical, right? I think that's important to know. In the old days, I didn't know if people had political thoughts, really. It was just, you don't talk about it. And so I think it's trite now to think that, the deep state is not political, but they really weren't, right? They were just following the evidence where it led. And I think that's important to know. On the operational side of the house, you're not an action hero. What you are is someone who's out there in the world trying to find people with placement and access to information that the United States government needs to give it decision advantages and to aid in statecraft or military operations at the strategic level. And so you find those people, you befriend those people, you build trust and confidence with those people, and ultimately you ask those people, you assess them to see if they could if they could manage a secret clandestine relationship. And if the answer to those things is yes, you find a way to look at what their motivations are and why they might be willing to work against or even betray their state, their rogue state, their terrorist group, their narco trafficking ring, whatever it is, for the benefit of themselves, right? And also for the benefit of the United States government. And then you handle them, you meet them securely, you debrief them, you assuage their fears, of which there are many, given the risks. You're sort of a journalist mixed with a priest, mixed with a psychologist, mixed with a sociologist, to try to deal, with these people. And then ultimately you write up what they have to say and you feed it into the analysts in Washington, and hopefully America might have a better policy or strategic outcome based on something that you collected from your agent or source.
That's awesome. And so again, these are two kind of the stereotypes. So it's more, the analyst is more of an introverted type, whereas the case officer is more of an extrovert. And
I mean,
I think it
that's
is.
what CIA says, but
Yeah.
I think that there are really important exceptions to those caricatures.
Gotcha. And then I mean, just through that description, as our listeners are hearing kind of what both does, and they're picking, what track they want to go. So say they're active duty right now, thinking about going to school to get a master's afterwards. Are there any particular programs that you would recommend, and they want to go work for the agency? Are there any particular programs you'd recommend for either role or
Um,
courses of study?
No, but I would say there is. Let me just myth bust in answer to your question, because there's this idea that you have to have a degree in international relations to work at CIA, and this is just not the case. I always tell students, like, IR is great, but CIA would maybe rather have you spend a little less time unpacking what constructivism might be, and a little bit more time learning how a nuclear centrifuge works, learning how nuclear enrichment works, learning how the internet works, learning where points of presence are, understanding human psychology, understanding cyber operations and electrical engineering. So the idea that you have to sort of be this, news junkie generalist, I think is not true. They have a need for engineers, right? I mean, how do you be a weapons and proliferation expert if you don't know anything about engineering? And all of these things that need to be done, right? It would be better if you knew how a nuclear bomb was made and you could debrief somebody in Korean or debrief somebody in Farsi, right? That would really be a better way to do it. Or doing area studies for South Asia and be able to have a real conversation with someone in Dari or Pashto. So I would say, if you are interested in neurobiology or you are interested in astrophysics, there's a role for everyone. And don't think that you need to not follow your core interest, but you rather need to follow sort of the generic IR path, because it's just not the case.
That's really, really, really helpful. So it's really just figure out what you're passionate about, because what you're passionate about is going to be what you're good at. And then if the agency sees a role for you to do that, they will find you. And the roles are broad enough to where you can kind of have any specialty, and they will find a role for you if they think that you've got what it takes to work for them. Excellent. Cool. All right. So I just had to just run through that because it's just such an interesting conversation topic. But now we're going to go to the real meat of the conversation, which is a discussion about PhD programs. So you touched a little bit about the differences between US PhDs and UK PhDs. Now, for our listeners, there's some kind of key questions that they have, in the application process. What kind of grades do they have to have? You'd mentioned standardized tests, like basically what will make someone competitive in each regard, both the US and UK, respective costs of each program, and then kind of like what the job market looks like afterwards.
Sure. So there's so many differences. I didn't do a US PhD. I did a US master's. I looked into it, but I don't really have, sort of intimate understanding of the US PhD. Although I think we can say that usually they're fully funded. And usually they even come with a stipend, right? And so in return for your stipend, you might be a teaching assistant or a research assistant or something like that. So you're not, going into debt the way you would be, right? Like in a master's program or an undergraduate program. And some of the stipends are not terrible. But the point is they're still pretty low. And so you might feel like you are treading water financially, right? Because your tuition is covered, and you are getting a stipend for being a TA, right? But like you're not buying a house, or you're not putting money away, anything like that. But nevertheless, right? Like someone paying you to learn and to be in school is still pretty awesome. So in the UK, but that, it's usually maybe a good 6 years, could be more, because you do have to do a 2-year top masters. You have to take your comprehensive exams to move over to PhD. Then you start your dissertation. In the UK, if you already have a master's degree, you can go right into the dissertation. So I spent 3 years. Cambridge does about, oh, I don't know, about a year on sort of methods and sort of the field generally, but there's no teaching requirement. You basically just spend a lot of time researching. So no one is paying you, you are paying the university, but it's shorter, right? And so just, as an example, for me and my wife, we thought, well, if I could, she said, look, treat your PhD like a full-time job, right? So like start work at 8, get done at 5:30, hit it hard every day. And so I was done in 3 years. And we thought better to just, you pay for the PhD, get back into the workforce and make up the money that way. Other people might say, I'd rather do it a little bit slower, but not go into any debt or have to come up with a big chunk of cash. So there's not one right way to do it. In terms of grades, different universities have different have different thresholds for this sort of thing. I mean, Cambridge advertises a 3.85 to enter the PhD program. I think I had a 3.85 in my major, but I didn't have a 3.85 overall. So I wouldn't get discouraged, right? Like if you see something on a website and you're like, well, maybe that's not me. Look, throw your hat in the ring, right? Make your case. Or like I did, separate out your major grades from my D in art history and my D in music appreciation, right? Like stuff like, I mean, in the US, at least for me, right, taking geology just dragged my GPA down. So I tried to sort of carve it up in different ways. There was one guy, just as a for instance, maybe for your veterans, he wasn't applying to the PhD. He was applying to a master's program. And at Cambridge, at least, you have like what's called the Board of Graduate Studies. And they're the first people that look at your application. And like, if it kind of passes the sniff test, then they'll forward it over to the department to see if the department wants to look at it further. And he had a 3.1 from the Air Force Academy, which generally speaking is not gonna do it. But I helped him. This is not about me. This is about him. But he said, do you think there's a way forward for me? And I did go over to the Board of Graduate Studies, and I just mentioned that service academies are a little bit stricter on grades, right? So at West Point, if you do average work, you'll get a C. And I think that's probably true in other service academies as well. And so a 3.1 is probably broadly equivalent to maybe, I don't know, a 3.4 or a 3.5. I'm just making this up, right? But it would be equivalent to a higher grade at a civilian university where everybody just gives out good grades, because why fight with students over the grades, right? I have better things to do. And so they actually did let him in. We had to get him around the Board of Graduate Studies right to the department, so the department could kind of have a look at him and his full package. So, I would say never say never, never say die, right? There's probably a way forward for you.
Yeah.
And then in terms of jobs, oh boy, I think it depends what kind of job you want, right? Like if you want a think tank job, just having PhD after your name might do. If you want a tenure track teaching job at an R1 university in the United States of America, you probably have to go to a top program. But it depends what you want to do, right? If you want to get a promotion at work, right? If you're a tech nerd at a national lab and you go get a PhD and then you go back to the national lab, like great, right? So it just depends on what your goal is afterwards.
Gotcha. Quick aside here. And so this is like one of the big things we talk to about with our applicants, because a lot of our applicants are imperfect, right? People, and we're like across the board, right? People who might not have had great grades in high school, but went to the military, matured, and are now ready to succeed in college. And the advice we give them is, hey, that high school GPA of yours is going to be something that people are going to have questions about, but you have to overcome it. And here's how. And usually it's by getting grades towards the front of the alphabet in ideally math and writing courses. And for people going to grad school, it's like, the LSAT for law school, you got to crush that if you got bad grades. And then business school is typically the GRE or the GMAT. Now, question for you. Now, say I am that Air Force Academy cadet who had the 3.1 GPA there. And if I were to go and get a master's degree at a US school and absolutely hit it out of the water, get like a 4.0, would Cambridge look at that 4.0 for the master's degree, or say 3.85? Or would they look at the back of the undergraduate grades?
Yeah, so it's a good question. And, full disclosure, I've never served on the admissions committee in Cambridge or at King's. So, this is just my sense of things. But I think they probably would look at the most, your most recent scores are your most relevant scores. And so I tend to think that they would look at your most recent scores or your most recent grades. And I'll give you an example of my own. I said I didn't have a 3.85, but remember how I said that I was doing the Naval War College. And so I got an A in my strategy and policy class. And so I did not have a complete transcript from the War College when I was applying to my own PhD program in Cambridge. But this is just a lucky break for me because I didn't have a 3.85 out of my master's program at Georgetown. But I was carrying a 4.0 at the Naval War College. And so, they took that. But I think one of the key differences, again, just goes back to, the US or the UK. In the US, they look at, sort of your grades and your numbers and whatever. And they think, all right, we'll take Alec. He seems like a super smart guy, and we'll just find a dissertation supervisor for him later or a committee for him later. In the UK, it's often best practice to say, okay, I want to work on the Anglo-American intelligence relationship. Who's the best person in the world to study under for that? Okay, I'm making my list, right? And my list is Mike Goodman or Dave Gioe at King's College London. It's Richard Aldrich or Chris Moran at the University of Warwick. It's Christopher Andrew in Cambridge. And you just make your little list, and then you see, and then you can write to those people and you say, hi, my name is Alec, and I'm getting out of the, and I did this with Chris Andrew. I said, hi, you don't know me. But I'm serving overseas for the U.S. government, and this is my kind of my proposal. And you have to, I guess this is an important point for your listeners. Potential supervisors get tons and tons of these sort of inquiry emails, and they don't have a ton of time to read them all. So you have to figure out who is, who's worth your time responding to, right? You just can't respond to all of them. And so what I tell people is to find a good fit with your PhD supervisor and to sell yourself in a brief email that, number one, says, this is me and this is what I want to do, and this is why I'm a good person to do it, right? So I'm Alec, and I want to look at NATO integration for military capabilities and doctrine. And oh, by the way, I speak 6 languages that NATO member countries write their doctrine in, right? You are a uniquely well-positioned person to do that, right? So what magic trick do you do, right? You want to do a PhD on the East German Stasi. Great. Do you speak German? If no, stop here. If no, learn German, so you have to figure out, I don't speak Russian, right? So there are just certain things that I won't be able to do. I'll give you an example from my own life. I spent a lot of my time in my doctoral dissertation writing about a case. It's called the Oleg Pankovsky case, and it was a case that he was a GRU colonel, and he was an agent or an asset or a source. I'll take any one of those of CIA and MI6, and they ran him jointly in the early Cold War. And so CIA had released something like 1,600 operational pages that said RV1, CS2, right? Well, I'm a former case officer. RV1 is rendezvous point one. CS2 is counter surveillance point two. And so I put all this stuff on a map, and the case came alive to me in ways that it wouldn't come alive to someone that doesn't know how to read this stuff, right? So what's the magic trick that you do that makes you well suited to pursue the PhD? And then, I think, and then what a supervisor will do is a supervisor will say, okay, does this person want to do anything related to the stuff that I'm interested in, right? I get lots of inquiries about like South Asian intelligence or India, Pakistan stuff. I don't know why. I don't do that stuff. I don't know anything about that stuff. I've never written on that stuff. I'm not even responding to that email, right? But if someone looks and sees what I've published on, and they say my research fits in with your research, right? Like that's going to interest me. And it'll also be easier for me because that's the kind of stuff I know, right? If I have to learn Chinese naval doctrine, right, it's not really a great use of my time. So finding that good fit is really important. And then people want to know if you're going to be needy or not, right? Because supervisors have their own teaching to do and their own research to do, and so if you present a polished email from someone who sounds like a grown-up and who has a clear idea of what they want to do, an interesting research question, and a method that's viable, right? So, okay, I want to understand Putin's relationship with the FSB. Okay, what's your strategy? Oh, well, I'm just going to look through Russian intelligence archives. Wrong answer, right? That's not a thing. You can't just rock up in Moscow and be like, hey, where are your archives on Ukraine? So the supervisor wants to see that there is a path forward, right, to answer your question, and that you've identified that path, and the supervisor basically just wants to give you sort of rudder inputs, versus sort of having to do it all for you. And so if you make yourself appealing, and if you present yourself like a person who can do the work and who's organized and who isn't going to bust through deadlines all the time. And that's another point that maybe I should just make. Having a publication, even if it's in a blog, Strategy Bridge or War on the Rocks or Small Wars Journal or Modern War Institute. I mean, peer reviewed would be better, of course. But a lot of people have good grades. So how do you differentiate yourself for a potential supervisor? And one of the ways you do that is you show that you can take your big, wonderful ideas and you can get them into the world. What a PhD dissertation supervisor doesn't want to see is an email that says, "Oh, sorry, Prof. I'm not going to have that chapter done for you because I'm still working on it. I'm still doing some research. I'm still doing this." My PhD supervisor said, quote, "Don't get it right, get it written." And so there's this problem with paralysis, right? And so if I have three people who look like they might be good PhD candidates, and I don't do a lot of supervising, so this is just, me sort of, personally more than anecdotally, I would want to see that person was able to just get their ideas into a publishable form and get it out the door, right? Because if you have a 4.0 from Harvard, but you just can't get off the starting block because you want to do more research and more research and more research and more research, that's just going to cause frustration later on, right? I mean, in the U.S. intelligence community, we have an ICOD, right? Information cutoff date. And you can't just be sitting there waiting to publish your piece of analysis, because what if something comes in from U.S. Embassy Singapore tomorrow morning? So maybe I should just hold it for another day. At some point, you just got to get that bad boy out the door. And so, potential supervisors, I think, want to be able to see that you can execute on your sort of academic plan.
That's okay. So all this, I think, it seems like it's really beneficial for veterans, like this process. And here's kind of like what I'm hearing from it is, so number one, and from the UK side, you're pitching yourself to a professor. I'd hazard a guess that there are not a lot of military veterans who are applying for these programs. And so professors, especially in areas such as intelligence studies, foreign policy, et cetera, would love to have a perspective of someone who's actually done this work in the real world rather than an intellectual. So is that accurate?
It could be. I think it's highly dependent on the person. I think sometimes where vets get into trouble, particularly, so I'm in intelligence studies. I can really only speak of intelligence studies, but sometimes a vet might overplay their hand by saying, I've spent 4 years in the military. I'm a trained intelligence analyst or trained intelligence officer. And basically, you just need to give me the PhD because it's just, constructive credit for, what I've done in the fleet or in the Navy or whatever. And so that's a path to disaster. You need to, you bring real world understanding that is needed in the ivory tower for sure. But if you approach it like, dear prof, if you only knew what I knew, you'd just say, this is a PhD and it's perfect and move on. And, you can't teach me anything. And so I have seen things, with people who have served kind of go sideways because they're either not teachable or maybe they write in an intelligent style instead of in an academic style. So there are, just rocking up and wanting college credit for your courses might work, for some university programs, but it's not going to work, at the doctoral level. And so I think having some confidence, right, that you've done good work out in the Air Force or wherever you've been, but now you're ready to sort of, start at the beginning in some senses and understand what the university wants from you and how research is done and how the academic style is different than an intelligence style. And I'll give you just one example. I wrote a piece. My wife did most of the work with a guy called Jeremy Parkhurst, and we wrote a piece. And first of all, it was Jeremy and my wife Thea, and they submitted it to this journal, and it was not long enough. It didn't really have a literature review. It didn't smell academic to peer reviewers. The ideas were great. The ideas were spot on, but it wasn't like, if you're a mom and you need to feed your baby bird, right? Like pre-chewed up worm, right? Like so I came on board this writing team and I basically just made it digestible to peer reviewers, right? And so my wife was like, why are you adding these words? And I was like, well, because it's too short, right? Like you just have to follow the formula. And so we eventually got it published. And so Jeremy works in the private sector and he's an Air Force veteran, and he's spent a long time. And my wife is a CIA veteran and a DIA veteran, and she was working in the private sector. And she was like, well, why are you making this piece longer? Things should be shorter. That's true in the private sector, but in academia, things are sort of needlessly too long. And so you just have to make things, sort of recognizable to academics. And so finding out what they value and sort of packaging your work in ways that they value is the path to success. And so people might want to fight with that, but what do they say in exercises, right? Don't fight the white. Like you just kind of have to go with it, right? If you want to be part of a university, you got to write in their style. You have to do a literature review, and that it just is what it is, right? You have to follow the methodology of your discipline, right? You can't just say, well, I know this is right because I've been an intelligence officer, right? No, it's long division. You got to show your work.
Gotcha. And so this is good segue to my next question is, I take it you've worked with veterans throughout your career, and we haven't even touched on your time teaching at West Point. I'll get a question in there about that in a second. But at the PhD level, having worked with veterans, what do you think some of the strengths and weaknesses they bring to the table are, and what advice do you have to veterans? Say they get into the program, how they can be successful in the classroom. Any type of tough love advice you can give would be greatly appreciated.
Sure. Well, I think, veterans, people who are used to just taking a task and just doing it, I think if I could give you a difference, after teaching at West Point for 10 years and King's for 4, cadets will just march out smartly because they just want to get started. And, sometimes I make the joke that they march out smartly in 180 degrees the wrong direction, but they're just ready to get started and roll up their sleeves and just sort of dig in. Whereas sometimes I see, or in, in seminar work or whatever, right, at West Point, someone is ready to always take charge, right? Whereas at a civilian university, what I've seen more of is, students kind of thinking about the question. Maybe I need to go get a coffee. Who's going to be in charge here? I'm not really sure. Does anybody have anything to say? And it's just a different vibe is all. But I think what I would say for veterans is to take that level of sort of task orientedness, and attack it, right? I think also it would be important for them to understand that people in their university environments don't see the world, that they see it in. So that could be an important, thing to understand, right? When, Alec, you and I are, we're shipmates, and that's great. And we probably see, generally speaking, the role of America in the world in broadly similar ways or whatever, right? And we signed up because we think there's an honor in serving our country and patriotism and all this stuff. People in your civilian PhD program or your master's program might have entirely different views of the world, or of America's role in the world, or Britain's role in the world, or whatever. So that's really important, because your ideas that you might have heard in a service academy or out in the military, they might be challenged, and sometimes that can be uncomfortable. The other thing I would say is that, at least in British academia, I can't really speak to a UK PhD program. No one is going to hold your hand, and so at a service academy, right? You have to go to lectures and classes and seminars, and they're taking attendance. And at West Point, if a student had an unauthorized absence, it triggers a whole thing. Whereas at King's, look, if you come, to the seminar, great, you should. If you miss a lecture, okay, whatever, right? Your education is kind of your responsibility, and so it's like Dead Poets Society, right? You could seize the marrow, right, or carpe diem, or whatever it is, seize the day, right? You could suck the marrow out of that experience and go to all the extra lectures and go to the bonus stuff and go to guest speakers and events and really immerse yourself, or you could not. And on this point, I want to come back to a couple other things, but on this point, while I was doing my PhD full time, a buddy of mine was on active duty and was doing a PhD part time. Your listeners might want to know, well, maybe I'll do it full time, maybe I'll do it part time. And he couldn't. A lot of university events are lunches or brown bags or whatever, and he just couldn't come to anything. And so it was really hard for him to, like, the work was the work, and he was getting his work done, but all of that bonus stuff, right? Or I would see my friends, I would write in the library with my friends for a couple hours in the morning, and we'd go get lunch and we'd talk about whatever, or research or sources that we were using. And he just missed out on that stuff because, he's trying to do his PhD on nights and weekends. And so you're sort of missing being part of the vibrant intellectual life of the university if you decide to just do it part-time. So I think that's really worth noting. But let me just get back briefly to this organization thing. So at a service academy, or maybe even at a civilian university, your professor might say, okay, guys, you're going to have a paper due. It's going to be 5,000 words, and it's due, at the last lesson before Christmas, right? But by lesson 5, I want a potential topic. By lesson 7, I want a potential research question. By lesson 12, I want an outline. By lesson 15, I want an annotated bibliography. By lesson 19, I want a rough draft, right? And they scaffolded, so all you're getting is multiple 25-meter targets, right? Whereas at least at King's, I'll say, and I think it was true in Cambridge as well, no one is going to hold your hand, right, and scaffold that work for you. So a veteran might say, well, when is lunch, and when is dinner, and when is this due, and what should I be doing now? Should I be in the library right now? You have to adult all this yourself. No one is gonna tell you that stuff. And so sometimes I've seen vets get a little bit lost in the flexibility of higher ed because no one cares where you are or what you're doing. At West Point, there's a lights out time, right? I mean, at King's, you can go to bed at 7 p.m. or you can stay up till 3 in the morning writing. I don't care. And so vets sometimes go from a very structured, very rigid experience to at least British academia, where, hey, the library's over there. Here's your research question. Go to the lecture. Go to the library. Go to the seminar. We'll talk about it. But 100% of their grade is the paper that's due at the end. No class participation. No pop quiz. No midterm. None of the stuff that your folks might expect there to be, right? So it's all riding on writing a good paper. So don't wait till the last minute, right? But I'm not gonna, me as an academic, I'm not gonna hold your feet to the fire, right? That's up to you. And so that's something I think that vets should keep in mind, because sometimes it's a little bit uncomfortable not having that, at 0800 I do this, 0900 I do that, right? No one's going to tell you that.
Yeah, no, I got you 100%. So yeah, as a at Wharton, when I was getting my MBA, it was always very funny because classroom attendance wasn't mandatory there either. And it was like the vets thought that showing up 5 minutes early to class was a personality trait, where it's like most people just kind of sashay in and sashay out if they even bothered. So yeah, it is funny and something we have to unlearn. So I do have, I know we're running up on time, but I do have a couple. If there's two questions I'll kind of roll into one. So I'm interested in the career aspect of it. And so I'd like to hear how you went from Cambridge to getting your job at West Point. And with that, people who are maybe considering getting a PhD specifically in war studies at King's College, what type of careers they can get themselves into.
Sure. Yeah. So going from Cambridge, um, I so this is going to sound more sort of ego-y than I want it to sound, but academic salaries in the UK are a lot lower than they are in the US. I think that's just a rule that is true. And so, I graduated with my PhD and I got done, 4 years of undergrad and 2 years of Georgetown and 3 years of Cambridge. And then I was looking at like postdocs or lectureships in the UK. And at this time, it was 2014, 2013, that time, they were paying maybe 33,000 pounds. So, 40 grand maybe. And I was just like, I'm not doing that, right? Because I'm not at that stage of my life because I worked for 11 years before going back to school. And so I think my ego wouldn't sort of let me start at the bottom. And I complained about it to a British head of a department, and they were looking for someone like me. And he said, "Dave, I'm sorry, but I just have to start you really low because there's no mechanism to sort of give you any credit for all the stuff you know and you did before going to Cambridge." And so my ego and my pocketbook and my family responsibilities all wouldn't really accept that. And so it just looked like the UK was kind of closed off to me, because I was, I don't know, in my late 30s, and just me, right, just Dave. I just wasn't gonna start at the beginning. Whereas, in the UK, you do 3 years of university, 1 year of a master's, 3 years of a PhD. You could be 26 or 27 getting done, right? And so maybe you could live on that. But I had a family, I couldn't do that. And so I applied around a lot, and I have to give West Point a lot of credit. They looked, I was at this time a lieutenant commander in the reserves, and they, civilian salaries will never match military salaries in academia, by and large. But West Point said, look, we understand that you're not, a brand new minted PhD, and they really did the best they could for me. And so I could afford to sort of live, and so that's why I chose West Point. And I also had, I don't know, 10 or 11 years of government service. And so I picked up, under the federal retirement programs. And, so it just made sense for me to come back home. Also, there's boy, I mean, how do I say this nicely? academia doesn't always love former military people or former case officers, and I've been on college campuses, like where I'm the bad guy. And so, West Point valued what I had done, and they valued what I brought to the table, and they valued the insights that I could provide to cadets based on my career. And a lot of other places, I'm sorry to say, don't do that. And so I asked a mentor where I should go to work after my PhD. And he said, well, Dave, you have to go to a big state school or a big school in the South or a service academy. That's exactly what he said, right? Because those are the kinds of schools, just from a cultural perspective, that are going to be more receptive to someone like you. Again, there are exceptions to all of these rules, right? For every time I say that, there's going to be an Ivy League school that has a great job for someone, or Harvard has an Intel, project. Yale is interested in this kind of stuff. Dartmouth has the Dickey Center. So this is a caricature, right? And there's tons of exceptions to it, but just based on my own applying around for jobs, I applied for several jobs, and I'll just say in the case of Dave, I only got I got invited to interview either at big state schools in the South or at service academies. So, I guess maybe he was right. In terms of King's, King's is a wonderful place. I love war studies. I think it's great. I think it's interdisciplinary, and it's dynamic, and it's big enough that almost no matter what you're interested in cyber, hardcore nerd stuff, or cyber policy, or the history of war, or grand strategy, or intelligence studies, or conflict and development. There's a place for you at King's, and so I'm a big fan. And then I think you can do, almost whatever you want, right? So I think King's has the reputation, and has the faculty, and has the publishing power, if you like, where people could get good jobs in academia. I know several King's PhD holders who are Americans and who do have good teaching jobs in the U.S. So I think not every university is going to translate, right? I think there is a snobbiness factor that you can't entirely ignore. But King's does well there, and so that's good. There's also think tanks, and of course you can also go get other academic jobs as well, right? There's places like the DARPA for Intel people, right, called IARPA or whatever, right? So you can take your PhD and then teach at National Intelligence University, right? Or you can do lots of stuff. So I'm a fan of doing the PhD, but I would just say don't do it for vanity, right? Don't do it just because you want doctor on your nameplate. Do it because you have a burning passion to really spend either 3 years full time, and I mean full time, or 6 or 7 years, nights and weekends, working on one project, right? Like if you love Fruit Loops, I hope you love them enough to have them every meal for 4 years, because that's what a PhD is. And so if you're just sort of finding a topic because you want PhD after your name, I think it's going to be a slog for you. But if you think to yourself, you know what, I'd really love to teach. Maybe I'd like to adjunct. You don't need a PhD to adjunct, but it helps. Or if I want a job at a think tank, or I want a job at a university or whatever, and a PhD is the way, is the key that unlocks that career door for you, then do it. But really go into it, sort of knowing that this is something that you need to focus on. And also, just speaking for supervisors, don't make your supervisor chase you or motivate you or whatever, right? Like you got to be self-motivated in order to be successful in this regard. And you just have to have a passion, right? I really want to know about XYZ. Anyway, go ahead.
All right. So last question for you. Give our listeners any last words of wisdom you may have about the PhD process and how to get there.
Sure. So I give a talk that basically, if you look at my resume, you think, oh, Dave never fails at anything. I fail at stuff all the time. I got rejected from CIA twice, and I only got in on my third time. I got into Cambridge. I got rejected from Oxford. I didn't get tons of academic jobs that I applied for. I didn't get grants that I applied for. And so there's just a lot of failure behind the scenes that people don't see, And so I think you just have to be able to, Rocky talks about, it's not how hard you can hit, it's how hard you can get hit and get up and keep going, right? And, rejection hurts, right? Getting rejected from a PhD program, I got rejected from plenty of master's programs as well. And, I missed my first look at 4. And so, those kinds of things hurt, right? And so you just have to, you can't complain and you can't say it was unfair or whatever, right? You just have to pick yourself up. Why didn't I get this promotion? Why didn't I get into this program? What can I do better, right? Can I be a department head and do that better? Can I apply to a different program? Can I find a different supervisor? Can I do better on my LSAT or my GRE? What is it that I can do to make myself more competitive? Because you're not going to get everything you want, and certainly not on your first try. So I think, a little bit of resilience will go a long way. And I think actually the veteran community is pretty good at this because, at least at West Point, these poor cadets, I mean, they literally get punched in the face at boxing class and then they have to come take American history or whatever, right? So they have a good level of resilience. And to be honest, I don't see the same level of resilience sometimes in the civilian students. So I think military people and veterans are actually well suited to sort of throw their hat in the ring and say, okay, I'm going to give this my best. And sometimes the cookie just doesn't crumble my way, and that's fine too. So, if you're looking at people's CVs and you see that they have fancy schools or fancy internships or fancy publications or whatever, right? I have a lot of publications and I get rejected for, way more stuff than I ever publish. So I just think, failure is baked into no matter what you do. And there's a lot of failure or a lot of rejection, I would say, in academia. Don't take it personally. Part of it's just a numbers game, right? Like they might not just have a place for you this year. Maybe I'll end on one example where I applied to Cambridge first time in 2010 and I got rejected. And for political reasons that I shouldn't get into on your podcast, I was told to apply to a different department and wait a year and things would shake out differently. So I got accepted in 2011. So there are paths forward, but they might not be directly, sort of linear paths forward, if you like. And so I think it's really worth it, to have goals, to apply broadly, and to be open to new things or new programs, right? The best program might not be at the fanciest school, right? The best program in clinical psychology might not be at, the top 3 school, right? It might be somewhere else. And so, or you might think, oh, well, this supervisor is my exact perfect fit, right? But that supervisor might not be at the fanciest school. I would choose fit over, sort of ego sweatshirt and bumper sticker stuff. So you have to really think broadly and deeply about what the options are and maybe consider some things that you hadn't other, just, it's more than just going through US News and World Report and, looking at rankings, right? There's a lot more to it. And especially at the PhD level, I've seen people have bad supervisors at great schools, and boy, does it suck to be them, right? Because your supervisor might not be very interested in you, might not be very helpful, might not be a good sounding board. I was so lucky to have a mentor who I think of as sort of a father figure in some senses. And he's Christopher Andrew is a wonderful man. And sometimes he said, well, just, don't come to my office, just come to my house and we'll have tea and cookies and we'll just talk. So, you want that kind of person who's personally interested in your success. And if that's at the school that you want to go to, so much the better. But if you're choosing between the two, the person who's invested in your success is always the right answer.
Awesome. David, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate that. And I know our listeners will as well.
Great. Thanks, Alec.
That's all we have for this episode. Join us next week, same time, same place, where we share more Service to School stories. Service to School Stories is hosted by Sydney Mathis, Chief Program Officer, and Alec Emmert, Service to School CEO. Our podcast is produced and edited by our Director of Communication, Amanda Tobias. Service to School is a 501c3 nonprofit providing free college admission support to transitioning service members and veterans. Join us next week and follow us for more on your favorite social media platforms.